Welcome to the debate. So imagine standing in the smoldering ruins of a house.
Okay.
A house that was violently taken from your family generations ago. You finally have the deed back, but the walls are charred, the foundation is crumbling.
Yeah, it's a complete mess.
Right. So the question is, do you spend your remaining energy hunting down the arsonist to make them pay? Or do you, pick up a trowel, forget the ashes, and start laying new bricks?
See, I would argue that if the arsonist still lives right next door and, they are still holding a match, you cannot lay new bricks.
You don't think so?
You simply can't. I mean, you can't rebuild when the fundamental threat, the injustice itself, remains entirely unaddressed.
And that exact tension is what we are unpacking today. We're looking at a stark conceptual clash between two revolutionary paradigms that emerge in the aftermath of deep systemic oppression.
Two very different paths.
Extremely different. On one hand, you have the path of forgiveness, unity, and reconciliation, a philosophy most famously embodied by Nelson Mandela in South Africa.
Right.
And on the other extreme, you have the path of uncompromising truth, resistance, and taking justice by any means necessary, an ideology represented in our framework by Osama bin Laden.
Exactly.
So the core question we have to explore is this: is true liberation and peace built through the incredibly difficult work of forgiveness, or must justice and freedom be forcefully taken at any cost?
A massive question.
It is, and I'll be defending the perspective that salvation and true freedom absolutely require rising above division. Healing just has to be chosen over vengeance, because a future built on hatred is, well, it's structurally unstable.
And I will be defending the opposing framework. I'm arguing that demanding justice through direct, uncompromising confrontation is fundamentally necessary.
Even with the costs.
Especially with the costs. Because unity without accountability isn't peace. It's simply a surrender to the oppressor. It really asks what a traumatized people owe to themselves versus what they owe to some hypothetical future.
Well, let me start by laying out why the framework of reconciliation is frankly the only mathematically viable equation for a surviving society.
Okay, let's hear the math.
Equality cannot be built on a foundation of hatred. It just can't. If we replace one form of oppression with another, society has learned absolutely nothing.
But replacing oppression isn't what resistance is.
Let me look at the mechanics of regime change for a second. When an oppressed group seizes power and simply turns the machinery of state violence back against their former abusers, the societal structure hasn't actually changed.
I disagree, but go on.
The hierarchy is identical. Literally, only the faces at the top and the bottom have swapped. The ultimate goal, the only goal that truly secures freedom, has to be to rebuild a broken nation.
Right, but whose version of a nation?
A unified one. You cannot rebuild while nursing a blood feud. It requires unity. It requires the profound, honestly agonizing choice to not let hatred dictate the constitutional foundation of a new country.
Okay, I come at it from a completely different way. The fundamental flaw in your framework is that it asks the oppressed to bear the entire psychological and physical burden of peace.
It asks them to be the bigger person, yes.
No, it asks them to carry the weight while the oppressor gets to escape accountability completely. Let's look at the actual reality of power dynamics. Equality is not a gift.
Of course not.
It is never freely given by those who benefit from oppression because the oppressor's entire lifestyle relies on that subjugation. Therefore, equality must be demanded. It has to be taken.
But taken how?
By confronting the system. If the path to equality relies on waiting for the oppressor's conscience to magically awaken, or, waiting for a peaceful transition that satisfies the comfort of the powerful,
I'm not saying we wait.
it guarantees that equality will never actually arrive. Patience in the face of structural violence is basically complicity in your own subjugation.
I see why you think that, but let's look at the actual mechanics of what you're suggesting. You say equality must be taken by any means necessary when an oppressor refuses to grant it. But the means directly dictate the ends.
They have to, because the oppressor's refusal to grant equality is in itself an ongoing act of violence.
Right.
You are dealing with an entity that only understands force.
But what is the ultimate cost of using unrestrained force? If the path to equality relies on violence, the resulting equality will always carry the scars of that violence.
Scars heal.
Do they? I'm not just speaking poetically here. This is a structural reality. Listeners might be thinking, well, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. But think about how a state is built.
Okay.
If you forcefully dismantle an oppressive regime using unrestrained violence, you are inherently empowering the most violent elements within your own movement.
Not necessarily.
You absolutely are. The generals and the guerrilla fighters become your new politicians. You establish violence as the legitimate currency of political change. So I have to ask, if we force compliance through violence, haven't we just become the new oppressors?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. I really don't.
Why not?
Let me tell you why. You are equating the violence of the oppressor with the resistance of the oppressed. And structurally, morally, they are entirely different mechanisms.
Violence is violence.
No, it's not. The oppressor uses violence to maintain a system of subjugation. The oppressed use force to dismantle that system. When the framework argues that you don't ask your oppressor for justice, you demand it, it's acknowledging a basic law of sociology.
Which is?
Power concedes nothing without a demand. Why does an oppressor yield? Because the cost of maintaining the oppression has been made incredibly high.
Right, by making them suffer.
By resisting. If you rely purely on moral persuasion, you leave the power structure intact. The idea that resisting violently automatically makes you an oppressor is, frankly, a philosophical trap designed to keep marginalized people docile.
It's not a trap, it's a historical warning. Just look at almost any violent revolution in the 20th century. When you say you take it by any means necessary, you are writing a blank check for collateral damage.
Every revolution has damage.
But that damage isn't just physical infrastructure. It fractures the psychological foundation of whatever society you are trying to build.
Only if you fail to address the root causes.
No, even if you succeed. If your liberation is achieved by matching the brutality of your oppressor, the state you construct the day after the revolution will require brutality to maintain itself, because that is the only tool your new leadership knows how to use.
But what is the alternative you're offering? Let's wait. Let's endure?
No, I'm saying,
If the path is patience, generations live and die under the boot of injustice, while waiting for the oppressor to feel charitable.
that's a mischaracterization of reconciliation.
To say we must avoid the scars of violence is a luxury for those who aren't currently bleeding. The oppressed are already scarred. Taking power back is how you stop the bleeding, even if applying the tourniquet hurts.
Which forces us to ask what kind of freedom we are actually trying to achieve. You're talking about stopping the bleeding, but I'm talking about rehabilitating the patient so they can actually walk again.
They have to survive first.
Yes, but there are two definitions of freedom at play here. One says freedom is something you fight for unapologetically, without negotiation.
Exactly.
But the counterweight to that, and I find this vastly more compelling, is that freedom without peace is profoundly incomplete. An angry, deeply divided nation, even if it has overthrown its formal oppressor, cannot truly be free.
Well, that depends entirely on how you define peace. And here is where I think the framework delivers a devastating critique of your definition. Peace without justice is just silence.
I don't think it's just silence, it's the absence of war.
Hold on, let me finish this thought, because the mechanics of this are vital.
Sure, go ahead. When you prioritize unity over accountability, you are demanding that the victims of oppression silence their grief and their anger to make the oppressor comfortable.
Not comfortable, safe.
You talk about unity as if it's an absolute, unquestionable good. But unity with injustice is surrender. Think about what silence actually looks like in this context.
Okay.
It looks like systemic economic disparity that we just agree not to talk about anymore. It looks like the former oppressors keeping all the land and wealth they stole, while the oppressed get a new flag and a national anthem.
That's incredibly cynical.
It's realistic. If the systems of oppression remain, but we all agree to stop fighting about it so we can have unity, the oppressed haven't gained freedom, they've just been pacified.
I vehemently disagree with that characterization. Unity is not pacification, and it is certainly not surrender. Then what is it?
Unity is the essential pragmatic strength required for a broken nation to rebuild. You are framing unity as if it means sweeping the past under the rug.
Doesn't it?
No, that's not what the reconciliation paradigm demands.
Look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about acknowledging that you have to share the exact same geographic and economic space with your former enemies.
But at what cost?
If you refuse unity because you demand perfect, punitive justice, you ensure a state of perpetual civil war. How can a nation be free if it devotes all its resources, its political capital, and its emotional bandwidth to endless internal conflict?
It devotes its resources to truth. You are so focused on the aesthetics of a functioning state, the shared space, the economic stability, the gross domestic product,
Those are things people need to live.
that you are willing to sacrifice the moral foundation of that state to get it. A nation rebuilt on top of unaddressed atrocities is just a mass grave with a fresh coat of paint.
Okay, that's incredibly evocative, but it completely ignores the pragmatic reality of human survival. Yes, peace without perfect justice might be silent at times, but justice without peace is a slaughterhouse.
That's quite a leap.
It's historical precedent. If freedom doesn't include the safety to walk down the street without fear of sectarian retribution, it is merely a theoretical freedom.
See, this gets right to the most emotionally volatile core of this entire debate. It's how we handle the visceral, human desire for revenge versus the strategic necessity of forgiveness.
Right.
Let's be unequivocally honest here. When people are oppressed for generations, they want revenge. They want the people who destroyed their families, stole their land, and stripped them of their humanity to suffer.
Yes, they do.
And they have every absolute right to feel that way. To deny them that anger is to deny them their humanity.
I am not denying the anger. The Mandela paradigm explicitly validates that anger. I mean, enduring 27 years in a brutal forced labor prison gives anyone every conceivable reason to seek revenge.
Exactly.
The anger is natural, it is justified, and it is entirely real. But, and this is the definitive pivot, having the right to feel revenge does not make revenge the correct blueprint for a society.
But you are championing forgiveness, and I need to explain the structural hazard of forgiveness.
A hazard?
Yes, it is incredibly dangerous because it lets the oppressor escape accountability. When you forgive systemic abusers, you create a massive moral hazard.
I don't see it as a moral hazard.
You signal to them and to future generations and to the international community that there are ultimately no catastrophic consequences for horrific actions. You just have to wait for the political transition, say you're sorry at a tribunal, and keep your stolen wealth. The structural hazard of impunity is that it guarantees oppression will happen again.
That's a compelling argument, but I would frame the mechanism of forgiveness completely differently.
How so?
You are looking at forgiveness as a transaction where the oppressor wins and the victim loses. But there is a far more sophisticated conceptual framework at play here. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not amnesia.
It functions like it.
No, it's a highly strategic, immensely powerful choice to ensure that hatred does not dictate your future.
By letting them off the hook.
No, by refusing to let them write the rest of your story. Listeners might be thinking, well, forgiveness just sounds like letting the bad guys win. But let's look at the actual psychology of regime change and revenge.
Okay.
If your entire post-liberation identity is based on punishing your former oppressors, your existence is still entirely defined by them. Your policies, your culture, your emotional state, everything is a reaction to them. They are still living rent-free in the architecture of your new society.
I think that's a stretch.
It's not. Forgiveness is the ultimate taking of power. It is looking at the oppressor and saying, you do not control us anymore, not even through our hatred of you. It disarms the oppressor's political leverage entirely.
That is a beautiful philosophical sentiment that rings completely hollow to someone whose child was murdered by the state.
That strategic choice you're praising, it requires an unimaginable emotional subsidy from the victims. You are telling people who have had everything taken from them that they must now also give up their right to retribution for the good of the nation.
Yes, I am.
That is an impossible, unjust demand. It's an emotional tax levied only on the oppressed.
It is an agonizing demand, I won't deny that. But what is the alternative? If we legitimize revenge as a political tool, where does it mathematically end?
It ends with justice.
How many generations must suffer before the scales are perfectly balanced? The cycle of retribution is infinite unless someone has the immense moral strength to absorb the blow and say, it stops with me. It stops when truth is established. It stops when the power structure is permanently dismantled. Salvation does not come from a forced, artificial healing.
Then where does it come from?
It comes from truth. It comes from confronting injustice head-on, directly and violently if necessary, not softening it for the history books.
But truth, without a mechanism for moving forward, is just a catalog of misery.
Truth is the foundation of dignity. You confront the oppressor not just to change the power structure, but to save your own dignity, to save your self-respect.
But dignity won't feed a starving population.
When you stand up to the person who has kept you kneeling, you reclaim your humanity. Without that dignity, without that self-respect forged in resistance, there is absolutely no salvation. You might have a quiet country, but you have a population with broken spirits.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are equating dignity exclusively with conflict. Let's follow your scenario to its logical conclusion.
Let's do it.
What happens after the confrontation? After you've bravely confronted the oppressor, after the battles are fought, the buildings are burned, and the truth is laid bare in all its brutality. If all that remains is anger, what exactly have we saved?
We've saved our souls. We've proven we are not subjugated.
But you haven't built a home. Salvation has to come from healing. I want to bring in a specific term that perfectly encapsulates what we're talking about, the concept of thom.
Ah, yes.
In Arabic, this word is often translated simply as oppression, but linguistically, it means putting something where it doesn't belong. It implies a deep, unjust darkness, a profound disruption of the natural balance of justice.
Right, the disruption caused by the oppressor.
Exactly. But your paradigm suggests that to eradicate the thom of the oppressor, we must introduce total chaos.
Not chaos, retribution.
But if your resistance destroys the infrastructure of society and your ongoing demand for vengeance destroys the social fabric, you have simply replaced the thom of the oppressor with the thom of chaos. The darkness remains. It just has a new source.
Well, that assumes that confrontation inevitably leads to permanent chaos. That's a fallacy. Confrontation leads to a reordering of power based on actual justice, rather than false peace. Chaos is often just the necessary transitional phase of dismantling thom.
I think there's a better analogy for what happens when a society embraces pure, uncompromising resistance. Think of it like an autoimmune disease.
Okay, I'm listening.
The oppressor is a deadly infection, and the violent resistance is the body's immune system fighting it off. That immune response is absolutely necessary to survive the infection.
Glad we agree on that much.
But if those antibodies, the fighters, the anger, the militant mindset, stay permanently activated after the infection is gone, they start attacking the healthy organs.
Uh-huh.
They destroy the new society from the inside. Healing, forgiveness, is how you tell the immune system to stand down so the body can actually live. Without forgiveness, peace remains functionally impossible.
You call it peace. I call it a ceasefire.
You can have a temporary ceasefire held in place by the threat of further violence, but you will not have actual peace. The people will forever be looking over their shoulders, waiting for the pendulum of vengeance to swing back toward them.
We are clearly looking at two fundamentally irreconcilable views of human nature and society here.
I think we are.
From my perspective, peace and healing are beautiful ideals. I won't deny their appeal. But demanding justice, protecting the vulnerable, and preserving dignity through uncompromising truth must always take precedence over a hollow, pacifying unity.
Even if it tears the country apart.
If you do not demand equality and freedom forcefully and fundamentally alter the power dynamics, you simply invite further oppression. The scars of resistance are a badge of honor. The scars of submission are a permanent brand.
And I would summarize my position by asserting that while the desire to forcefully take justice is profoundly understandable, it really is, it is a short-term reaction that jeopardizes long-term survival.
Survival at what cost, though?
Lasting freedom and the actual prevention of future tyranny can only be achieved through the brutal, difficult work of forgiveness. Unity isn't submission. It is the ultimate victory over an oppressor who tried to tear a society apart.
It's a deep tension. Honestly, it's a deep tension in the human psyche. We have this absolute, visceral necessity for accountability and dignity. We need to see the scales balanced.
We do.
But we also have a desperate societal necessity for healing, so that our children don't have to fight the exact same wars we did.
Exactly. And the frameworks we've examined today don't offer a clean way to harmonize those two needs. They force us to look at how societies recover from trauma and ask us to weigh the immense structural cost of both paths.
Which brings us right back to that smoldering ruin of a house.
Yeah.
Do you hunt the arsonist to secure your dignity and ensure they never strike again, even if it means you spend the rest of your life in the ashes? Or do you put down your weapon, pick up a trowel, and start the agonizing work of building a new home, knowing the arsonist might still be watching from the shadows?
It's a question without an easy answer.
It really is, but it's one every recovering society must eventually face. Thank you for joining us as we unpack these profound paradigms. We leave you with this single thought. When the flames finally die down, is your first instinct to weaponize the ashes or mix them into the mortar for tomorrow?